Greetings once again, poetry lovers. Well, it's time to start our adventure with one of my favorite poets. I know I keep saying this about everybody to read, but Thomas Hardy. Love me some Thomas Hardy. Have read. He was a probably best known as a novelist. I think Test of the D'Urbervilles and Under the Greenwood Tree and Jude the Obscure, a bunch of just marvelous novels that he wrote, but is widely anthologized as a poet, and a lot of famous poets, critics, and so forth believed him to be one of the finest poets of the 19th century. In fact, in some major anthologies, Hardy was included more often than T.S. Eliot or William Butler Yeats. So that's saying quite something. So the poem that we're going to start with is called Hap, and so Hap then, from your note, is another word for chance. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the form of the poem before we read it, because I think it's going to help to inform the lens through which we view the poem. So the form of the poem is a sonnet, but it's a modified one, okay, which makes sense since this is a poem about disorder on some levels. The form evokes that sense in its arrangement into two distinct quatrains rhyming A, B, A, B for the first quatrain, C, D, C, D for the second quatrain, and then you've got that distinct sestet that rhymes not E, F, E, F, G, G as you would expect from an English sonnet, but rhymes E, F, E, F, F, E. So I want you to note particularly the reversal of that rhyme, the end rhyme there, and let's just say this is a technical nod toward the reversal of common perceptions about the nature of God, at least as acknowledged by Christian believers. Hardy himself referred to himself as an agnostic, so we'll touch on that in a minute. Okay, so just for what it's worth, the interpretations of this poem are many and varied, and often slant toward what is known as biographical criticism. So side note, think of literary criticism as a lens through which one views a work of art. Christian criticism would view the poem from the perspective of Christian belief, and perhaps evaluate Hap as, a condemnation of Christian theology. Feminist criticism would assess the poem perhaps favorably, I'll put that in quotes, since Hardy doesn't use male pronouns to refer to God or the gods. Biographical criticism then would take into account what was happening in Hardy's life at the time that he wrote it, and evaluate the verse as a form of diary entry or something, revelatory in its ambitions, perhaps suggesting that Hardy had been dumped by his honey, or she had been eaten by a pack of wild dogs while they were traveling in South Africa or something. I even read an analysis of this poem as Hardy's response to Darwinism, which was in vogue at the time. Another that this poem reflected Hardy's frustration that he couldn't get his poems published, and this is why he began to write novels, which he did for the next 3 or 4 decades. But for us, we're just going to take a look at what Hardy has given us and go from there. So this is Hap by Thomas Hardy. If but some vengeful God would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy, that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. Then would I bear it, clench myself and die, sealed by the sense of ire unmerited, half eased in that a powerfuler than I had willed and meted me the tears I shed. But not so. How arrives it joy lies slain, and why unblooms the best hope ever sown? Crass casualty obstructs the sun and rain, and dicing time for gladness casts a moan. These purblind doomsters had as readily strown blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. Okay, so let's. I've written here for you the rhyme scheme, not too difficult to do, and had mentioned that already. I think I should tell you though that this the annotation for this poem is brought to you by the Palomino Forest Choice Number 2. It is a delightful California red cedar poem. It's pencil. It's just got a little bit of varnish on it, not too much, with that beautiful green ferrule and pink eraser. It writes more like a bee, a nice and dark line there, which I quite like. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of things. If but some vengeful God would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, so a circle thou, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy, that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. Okay, so it should put you in mind of something like an Old Testament view of God. Okay, so we'll say an Old Testament view of God. Notice a couple things, and I come at this from a couple different places. One is, look at the language, thou and thy and thy. This is sort of reminiscent of the King James Version, known in the business as KJV, King James Version of the Bible. So that informs it. The other thing is this. Notice that God is lowercased here, and so it's. We'll write this little note down. We'll say that it's that and not capital G, God. But also it's this Old Testament view of God as being this, wrathful, who is strikes out against us as human beings when we are naughty and so forth. This is the code of Hammurabi God, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, this sort of business. Okay, so notice also that there's this sense that by calling thou suffering thing. So this word choice then dehumanizes the speaker, well, all of humanity really. Okay, so calling us things, calling the speaker a thing like the rest of us, not worthy to gather up the crumbs under thy table, type of thing. Okay, and so then there's this. So the orientation again, as God is not being a loving God, but a wrathful God. Okay, let's see. So I think that one piece that's worth looking at is that there's a certain cosmic irony to this. All right. Again, that this God, the God of Hardy's poem, is not what we'd like to think of as a God of loving kindness. It's sort of the antithesis of this. Okay. One thing I wanted to point out is know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy. That God somehow profits from all the bad things that He flings in the path of the speaker in general, but human beings. The speaker specifically, but human beings in general. And then let's take a look at thy love's loss here. There's sort of two ways to look at that. One is perhaps the loss of a beloved. Okay, loss of a beloved. But also I think it's maybe a loss of feeling. The feeling of love. And what I'm going to point out here is that this is also this sense of love and hate. Okay, love and hate being diametric opposites. We think of hate as being the opposite of love. But I'm going to suggest, through the way Hardy points this out, is that it's not, and I think I've talked about this in class, it's not hate that's the opposite of love, it's indifference. And this is what he's going to arrive at here in particular. He's going to make this point manifest in the sestet. Okay? So let's see. I don't think there's really anything else to touch on here. You can hear a relatively consistent meter. If but some vengeful God would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, and so forth. Okay, so you can hear that that business. So there's very much this scientific or logic of the what's called the hypothetical syllogism. If this happens, then that happens. So he's saying, you know, if a God would talk to me, and you recall in the Old Testament, you know, God would routinely you know, talk to people, prophets, and so forth, you know, and they respond, you know, "Hear, Lord," and all that kind of thing. He's saying if God told me that this was the case, right, where He is intentionally throwing difficulties and loss and death and suffering and whatnot at the speaker, then he'd be like, "Then would I bear it?" All right. Notice the syntax inversion. This is one of the things that Hardy is famous for, is his use of the neologism as Hopkins used it, but also he's going to invert syntax in a way to alert the reader that there is something discordant at work, and this is part of what his what's the project of the poem. So I would bear it, clench myself. That's just a marvelous image here for you. It's not steel myself, you know, as in make myself, you know, hard against it, but the idea of clenching means to then be, you know, seized up as though the entire body is turned into something like, you know, a rigid fetal position or something. Okay, like to wither up. As animals tend to go into the fetal position before they die. Okay, steeled by the sense of ire or anger unmerited. Like, okay, I can, if it's God who's more powerful than I am, as he says here, half-eased in that a powerfuler. Okay, powerfuler. So here you've got this is a good example of metonymy. For a divinity. Okay, then I had willed and meted me, or allotted, given me the tears I shed. All right, so this ignores the business about you know, free will. So if you want to say that there's something, you know, that Hardy's doing here about saying to people, yeah, you know, how do you reconcile the fact that that God flings, you know, your wife dies of again earlier being eaten by a pack of wild dogs in South Africa, or, you know, your child being taken from you with the measles or you know, bubonic plague or what have you? How are you able to reconcile that in your minds? Well, you know, you're able to just say, well, it's God's will. I mean, God's more powerful than I am. God knows everything, you know, omniscient, omnipresent. That's cool. I just, you know, everything's in God's hands. You know, you've heard all this sort of business before, yes? Okay, so, but as we get down here to the sestet, but not so. So if you're scanning that, but not so. And so notice how he uses diction to echo the abrupt. It's either the abrupt realization that he's had, or that here he is, he's being okay, so didactic, in that he is teaching you something. All right, like the rest of us that are listening to him. That's not the way it is. So when he says, "How arrives at joy lies slain," so we've got the personification then of joy. Okay, so the personification. How is it, or how arrives it? Sorry, joy lies slain, and why unblooms the best hope ever sown? This is really nice. unblooms. So this is like, so remember the Hopkins poem, Spring and Fall. Oh, Margaret, are you grieving for the golden grove unleaving? So this is the same idea of the unblooming. Because if you think about it, the language of the poet laureate at the time, Tennyson, would have been something like, and why blooms not the best hope ever sown? But see, that's the reason this word works so much better than blooms not is that the suggestion is, if it doesn't bloom, it means that it never got to that stage, okay? That it is stopped short of its potential. But unblooms has not only that sort of the sniff of that idea, but also the idea that it bloomed and then, okay, it dies. All right, so this is, I think, to accentuate the irony here. And notice also that we're talking about he's using the language sown. So unblooms the best hope ever sown. So this, this is sort of a reference to Scripture about you reap what you sow and all those sorts of things, as though there is that's a causal relationship. If you do good works, if you're Puritan, you get to heaven. Okay, if you live a good, godly life, you get to heaven. These sorts of things, right? But he's going to make the point that no, that ain't it. Crass casualty obstructs the sun and rain. Crass casualty, notice how if you just want to take a look at the language, okay? Crass. So we got the hard C's there, the okay? Crass casualty. So we've got not only the hard C, but we've got then that discordant A sound, obstructs the sun and rain. And so notice here that it's not just the obstruction of, we think of obstructs the sun, like, oh, it's cloudy, we're bummed out because there's no sunshine. But there's also the sense that crass casualty obstructs the rain as well. Because if you're a farmer, you want some rain in there to help you with your crops. But it's chance here. So this is, again, you've got sort of the metonymy for chance. Which he then he doubles down. If I go ahead and use the gambling metaphor, and dicing time, okay, casts. So here we have the those two things in combination is extended metaphor. Extended metaphor related to this idea of chance. Okay, when we roll dice, it is, you don't know what's going to come up. I mean, there's some statistical stuff that might make an appearance if you're playing Yahtzee or something, but these two things play together. Okay, just as unblooms and sown, these are both extended metaphors. Yes, question, possibility. Okay. And dicing time for gladness casts a moan. All right, so it's a paradox there, yes? The idea of gladness and moaning being in the same vicinity. Okay, these purblind doomsters, so half-blind judges, had as readily strown blisses about my pilgrimage as pain. So there's just one quick thing about the ire unmerited. Once again, we're still in this this business about the Old Testament version of you get what you deserve, okay? And then, if you want to unpack, by the way, the personification of joy here, you would say something like, I suppose, if the tenor is joy, and the vehicle is, a human victim. And I'm saying victim here because to be slain means you're killed. It's not just, how arrives at joy lies dead. No, it's joy is, so you've got this marvelous idea of crass casualty and so forth. they have will that was not acknowledged here in that second quatrain in particular. Okay. I think before I go on, notice we've got these questions here that would normally be associated with people asking of God, and Hardy suggests that the act of asking God, why'd you do this to me, or asking chance, why'd you do this to me, is useless in either case. You're not going to get the answer. Unless you, again, if you're going to look at this through the lens of Christian orientation, maybe the answer is God's will, and then you're able to say, okay, well, I can live with that. And so then the ground here is going to be sort of an abrupt and, I would go so far as to say violent end of life. At the hand of a murderer. Okay. So you can see that. Move it up. All right. There we go. Let's see. Okay. So we've got that purblind doomsters is metonymy. For chance, so it's metonymic for personified chance. Okay, and then this business about my pilgrimage. Okay, so you should note that's metonymy for his life. Okay, metonymy for his life. So you'd ask yourself the question, well, gee, I see a bunch of metonymy in here, and why might that be? Again, when you're talking about figurative language and what is its effect, if it's a concept that you can't define, you can't quite grasp, then figurative language is a marvelous way to. We know that means to say something in terms of something else. In a way, it's getting to it by analogy, and this is sort of what's happening here. So the idea of pilgrimage, and there's no doubt that there's an irony here, okay, because, and we'll call that without doubt situational irony. Why? Who makes pilgrimages? Where do they go? I mean, generally people pilgrimage to religious sites, yes. And yet here at the end, it's the antithesis of that. I want to make two last points here about the purblind doomsters had as readily strown blisses. Okay, notice that's plural, as though there's a number of them, number of happy events. But how about this one? Pain. Notice, singular, as though pain is always there. I mean, in a sense, a little bit of a chilling ending, but this is, I mean, Hardy was criticized throughout his artistic career for being a pessimist, and being, gloomy Gus and all this kind of thing. But I don't see it that way. I see it more that, here's a guy he is struck by things and he muses upon them, and I think he also lives in his poetry and his other works of fiction in wonder at how people believe and why they believe the things that they believe. And so I think that Hap is just a poetic exploration of one way to look at the world. I don't think that you can necessarily say that, oh, gee, this is, Hap is the ultimate reflection of Hardy's worldview. I mean, I don't think you can say that. It rather is one worldview, and maybe there are multiples that are sort of folded into it. Okay, all right. Hope you enjoyed that.